The cold wind cut through the city streets like a knife, whistling between buildings and rustling through piles of discarded newspapers and empty soda cans. It was the kind of night that made people hurry along, tucking their hands into their pockets, pulling their coats tighter, desperate to get home where warmth and comfort waited. But for one man, there was no home to hurry to. Jerome had long since gotten used to the feeling of being invisible. He sat on the corner of a busy intersection, wrapped in layers of old, worn-out clothing, his fingers numb despite the gloves he'd found in a donation bin weeks ago. His sign, made from a torn-up piece of cardboard, rested against his knees, the marker letters smudged from wear. Anything helps. God bless. Some people walked past without so much as a glance. Others threw in spare change, $1 here or there, maybe a leftover sandwich from their lunch. Jerome never expected much. Hope was a dangerous thing when you lived the way he did. That night, just as he was about to curl up under the thin blanket he kept in his tent, he heard a faint whimper. At first, he thought he imagined it, the wind often played tricks on his ears, but then he heard it again, closer this time. He turned his head and saw something moving in the shadows near a row of overflowing trash bins. A dog. The animal was small, ribs pressing against its matted fur, its head lowered in exhaustion. It hesitated, watching Jerome with wary eyes, its tail tucked between its legs. It had probably been on its own for weeks, scavenging for scraps, barely surviving. Jerome knew that feeling all too well. "Hey, boy," he murmured, his voice gentle. He reached into the paper bag beside him, pulling out half of the sandwich someone had given him earlier. His stomach growled in protest. He hadn't eaten all day, but something about the way the dog looked at him made his hunger seem unimportant. The dog hesitated for a moment longer before inching forward, nose twitching at the scent of food. Jerome placed the sandwich on the ground and waited. Slowly, cautiously, the dog crept closer, snatched up the piece of bread, and swallowed it whole. It looked at Jerome again, its dark eyes searching, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. "You're not much different from me, huh?" Jerome said with a tired smile. From that night on, the two were inseparable. Jerome named him Shadow because the dog never left his side. No matter how hard the days got, no matter how little they had, Shadow stayed. He curled up next to Jerome at night, shared in whatever food they could find, and greeted him every morning with a wagging tail. For the first time in a long time, Jerome didn't feel so alone. But then, weeks later, something happened that neither of them could have expected. It was just another quiet afternoon, Jerome sitting outside his tent, Shadow resting his head on his lap. The usual sounds of the city played in the background, cars honking, people talking, the distant wail of a siren. And then, out of nowhere, two sleek black Mercedes rolled up to the curb in front of him. Jerome sat up straighter, confused. Cars like that didn't stop for people like him. They kept moving, gliding through the city without a second thought. But these two? They pulled over. They parked. And then, the doors opened. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, followed by another. They were well-dressed, clean-cut, their shoes polished so perfectly they reflected the city lights. Everything about them screamed money. Jerome felt his pulse quicken. People like that didn't belong in his world. And yet, here they were, standing just a few feet away, staring straight at him. Shadow growled softly, his body tensing. Jerome instinctively rested a hand on the dog's back, his mind racing. Who were these men? And what did they want with him? Jerome's fingers tightened slightly in Shadow's fur as the two men stepped closer. He wasn't sure what to expect. People in suits didn't usually stop to talk to him, unless it was to tell him to move along. But something about the way they carried themselves, the way they stood, made his stomach churn with unease. One of the men, tall with sharp eyes, took another step forward. He studied Jerome, his gaze flicking briefly to Shadow before returning to his face. The other man, slightly shorter but just as serious, stood with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching in silence. Jerome swallowed hard. "Can I help you?" His voice came out rough, dry from the cold air and too many days of not talking much to anyone but Shadow. The taller man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small photograph. He held it up so Jerome could see. Jerome leaned forward slightly, squinting. The image was old, a little worn around the edges. It showed a young boy, no older than 10, standing beside a dog that looked a lot like Shadow. The boy had dark skin, a round face, and eyes filled with a kind of happiness that Jerome hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't just the boy that caught his attention, it was the background. The cracked sidewalk, the familiar row of buildings in the distance. Jerome knew that street. His heart pounded in his chest. The man in the suit spoke at last, his voice calm but firm. "Do you recognize this place?" Jerome hesitated. He could lie. He could shake his head and tell them he'd never seen it before. But something in the man's tone told him that wouldn't work. Slowly, he nodded. "Yeah. I used to live near there. A long time ago." His voice was barely above a whisper. The two men exchanged a glance. The shorter one finally spoke, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. "And the boy?" Jerome's fingers tightened slightly in Shadow's fur as the two men stepped closer. He wasn't sure what to expect. People in suits didn't usually stop to talk to him, unless it was to tell him to move along. But something about the way they carried themselves, the way they stood, made his stomach churn with unease. One of the men, tall with sharp eyes, took another step forward. He studied Jerome, his gaze flicking briefly to Shadow before returning to his face. The other man, slightly shorter but just as serious, stood with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching in silence. Jerome swallowed hard. "Can I help you?" His voice came out rough, dry from the cold air and too many days of not talking much to anyone but Shadow. The taller man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small photograph. He held it up so Jerome could see. Jerome leaned forward slightly, squinting. The image was old, a little worn around the edges. It showed a young boy, no older than 10, standing beside a dog that looked a lot like Shadow. The boy had dark skin, a round face, and eyes filled with a kind of happiness that Jerome hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't just the boy that caught his attention, it was the background. The cracked sidewalk, the familiar row of buildings in the distance. Jerome knew that street. His heart pounded in his chest. The man in the suit spoke at last, his voice calm but firm. "Do you recognize this place?" Jerome hesitated. He could lie. He could shake his head and tell them he'd never seen it before. But something in the man's tone told him that wouldn't work. Slowly, he nodded. "Yeah. I used to live near there. A long time ago." His voice was barely above a whisper. The two men exchanged a glance. The shorter one finally spoke, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. "And the boy?" He glanced down at Shadow, who was watching the men carefully, ears perked up, muscles tense. Jerome didn't trust easily. Life had taught him that. But for some reason, his gut wasn't telling him to run. It wasn't screaming at him that these men were dangerous. It was telling him that whatever was happening right now was bigger than him. Bigger than he could possibly understand. Jerome exhaled, his breath shaky. "Fine," he muttered. "But Shadow comes with me." The taller man nodded. "Of course." Jerome stood slowly, brushing the dirt off his worn-out jeans. His legs ached from the cold, his fingers stiff as he gathered his few belongings. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but something told him there was no turning back now. As he climbed into the back seat of the sleek black Mercedes, Shadow jumping in beside him, Jerome felt the weight of the moment settle over him. For years, he had been forgotten. A ghost wandering the streets, barely noticed, barely existing. But tonight, something had changed. Tonight, the past had come looking for him. And Jerome had a feeling his life would never be the same again. The car's interior was warm, almost too warm after the biting cold outside. The scent of leather and something faintly expensive filled the air, making Jerome more aware than ever of the contrast between this world and his own. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his worn jacket stiff against the fine material. Shadow sat at his feet, ears flicking as his eyes darted between the two men in the front. The car moved smoothly through the streets, the hum of the engine barely audible. Jerome glanced out the tinted window, watching the city blur past. He had never been inside a car like this. It felt like stepping into another reality, one that didn't belong to him. He turned his gaze to the two men, his unease growing. "You gonna tell me what this is about, or do I have to guess?" The taller man, who had done most of the talking before, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "We will. But first, we need to get somewhere safe." Jerome frowned. "Safe from what?" Neither man answered. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Jerome's fingers curled into fists. He hated feeling like he was being led blind into something. Life on the streets had taught him to be cautious, to never trust too quickly. And yet, here he was, sitting in a luxury car with two strangers, being told that someone had been looking for him. His mind kept circling back to that photo. The boy. The street. The dog. Shadow let out a small huff and rested his chin on Jerome's knee. Jerome absently ran his fingers through the dog's fur, finding some comfort in the familiar warmth. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally slowed. Jerome sat up straighter, trying to catch a glimpse of where they were, but the windows were too dark to make out much. When the car stopped, the shorter man stepped out first, holding the door open. Jerome hesitated, his muscles tensing. He could bolt, grab Shadow and run. But where would he go? Back to his tent? Back to the streets? Something told him that whatever was happening right now wasn't just about him. He stepped out cautiously, Shadow following close. The cold hit him again, but the air here smelled different. Cleaner. The streets were quieter, the sidewalks less crowded. He turned and got his first proper look at where they had taken him. A building stood before them, large and old, with ivy creeping up its stone walls. It looked like something out of a different time, solid and imposing. The windows glowed softly from the inside, casting long shadows across the pavement. Jerome swallowed. "Where are we?" The taller man stepped beside him. "Somewhere private." That didn't answer his question, but Jerome didn't push. His gut told him the answers were coming whether he was ready for them or not. The shorter man pressed a code into a keypad by the door, and a soft beep sounded before the lock clicked open. He pushed the door wide, gesturing for Jerome to step inside. Jerome hesitated only a second before crossing the threshold. The inside was just as grand as the outside, high ceilings, polished wood floors, and walls lined with bookshelves. A large fireplace crackled in the corner, its warmth filling the room. Jerome turned to the men, his patience running out. "Enough with the mystery. Start talking." The taller man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Jerome stayed standing. "I'll stand." A brief pause, then the man sighed. "All right." He folded his hands in front of him. "First, let's start with your full name." Jerome frowned. "You already know my name." "Your full name." Jerome shifted, uncomfortable. "Jerome Carter." The shorter man exchanged a glance with the taller one before pulling something from his coat pocket, a file. He set it down on a nearby table and slid it open. Jerome caught a glimpse of papers, documents, an old photograph. Another photograph. This one made his chest tighten. It was a hospital photo. A newborn, wrapped in a thin blanket, tiny fingers curled into fists. The name written across the bottom in faded ink made his breath catch. Jerome Malik Carter. Jerome took a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. Where did you get that? The shorter man spoke softly. It was in your file. My file? Jerome's voice came out hoarse. What file? The taller man exhaled, as if bracing himself. You were placed in the foster system as an infant, correct? Jerome didn't answer. He didn't have to. They already knew. Your case was complicated, the man continued. There were missing documents. Unanswered questions. And then, he paused, his eyes sharp, searching Jerome's face. You vanished from the system. Jerome's throat tightened. He knew what they were talking about. The gaps. The missing years. Foster home after foster home. Some good, some bad, most indifferent. Then, at 16, he ran. Disappeared off the radar. No more shelters, no more paperwork, no more numbers tied to his name. Just streets and survival. He thought he had left all that behind. But somehow, these men had found him. Jerome's voice was low, wary. Why does this matter now? The shorter man glanced at Shadow, then back at Jerome. Because someone has been searching for you for a long time. Jerome shook his head. That doesn't make sense. I don't have any family. Nobody's looking for me. The man's expression didn't change. You do. Jerome's heart pounded. He wanted to call them liars. To tell them they had the wrong person. But deep down, something in his gut twisted in a way that told him, maybe, just maybe, they weren't lying. And that terrified him. He took another step back, Shadow pressing against his leg. I don't understand. Who? Before he could finish, the sound of a door opening down the hall made them all turn. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Jerome felt his breath hitch as a figure stepped into the light. A man. Older, with lines of age carved into his dark skin, his hair graying at the edges. But his eyes, those eyes looked achingly familiar. They locked onto Jerome with something between disbelief and something deeper. Something Jerome couldn't name. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the man whispered, barely audible. Jerome. And just like that, the ground beneath him felt like it was shifting. Jerome's body tensed at the sound of his name. The voice was rough, deep, carrying the weight of years behind it. He didn't recognize it, but something about it sent a shiver through him, something almost familiar yet distant, like a memory buried too deep to fully grasp. The man stood still, his hands slightly trembling at his sides. His eyes, dark and intense, never left Jerome's face. There was something in his expression that unsettled Jerome, something raw, pain, longing, regret. Jerome swallowed hard. Who are you? His own voice didn't sound like his. The man took a step closer, then stopped, as if afraid to move too fast. His lips parted, but for a long moment, no words came out. He just stared, taking in every inch of Jerome's face, his stance, the way Shadow hovered close to him. Finally, his voice cracked. I've been looking for you. Jerome shook his head. No. You haven't. Nobody has. The man let out a shaky breath. That's not true. Jerome's pulse pounded in his ears. His whole life, he had believed, known, that no one was looking for him. That no one cared. He had made peace with that a long time ago. And now, out of nowhere, this man, these men, this whole strange night was trying to tell him something different. Shadow let out a low whine, nudging Jerome's leg. The dog could sense the tension, the uncertainty. Jerome absently ran a hand through Shadow's fur, grounding himself. The shorter man, the one who had shown him the photograph, cleared his throat. "Jerome, this is—" "I don't care," Jerome snapped, his patience finally breaking. His voice came out sharp, his chest tightening as his emotions fought to surface. He pointed at the man in front of him. "I don't know him. I don't know any of you. And I don't know what kind of game this is, but I'm done." He turned on his heel, grabbing for the door. "Wait." The man's voice was almost desperate now. "Please, just listen to me." Jerome hesitated, his hand gripping the doorknob so tightly his fingers ached. "Just give me a few minutes," the man continued. "Then, if you want to leave, I won't stop you." Everything in Jerome screamed to walk away. To push past the confusion, the unanswered questions, the sudden, terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't what he thought it was. But something in the man's voice made him pause. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned back around. His heart pounded in his chest as he met the man's gaze again. "You have 2 minutes," he muttered. The man's lips pressed together, like he was holding back a flood of words. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "My name is David Carter." He exhaled, the weight of the name filling the room. "I'm your father." The words hit Jerome like a blow to the chest. He actually staggered back a step. The room seemed to tilt for a second, his ears ringing. He couldn't have heard that right. He couldn't have. No, the word left his mouth before he even thought about it. He shook his head, hard, as if trying to erase what had just been said. "That's not possible." David's eyes shone with something unreadable. "I know this is hard to believe." "Hard to believe?" Jerome let out a sharp, bitter laugh. His heart was hammering so hard it hurt. "You don't get to come out of nowhere and tell me you're my father. That's not how this works." David took a step closer. "I didn't abandon you, Jerome." His voice cracked slightly. "You were taken from me." Jerome froze. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. He could feel his breath quickening, his hands shaking slightly. "Taken?" David's gaze darkened, pain flashing across his face. "When you were a baby, there was a situation. I was in trouble. The kind of trouble that put you at risk. And before I could fix things, before I could keep you safe, you were gone." His voice dropped lower. "They told me you were dead." Jerome felt the blood drain from his face. His legs felt weak. He reached for the nearest chair and sank into it, Shadow pressing close against him. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just heard, but it felt like trying to hold on to water. It kept slipping through his fingers, impossible to make sense of. David watched him, his own expression filled with something close to agony. "I searched for you. For years. But I had no trail. No leads. Nothing. It wasn't until recently that I found out the truth." Jerome looked up sharply. "What truth?" David hesitated. The taller man, the one who had brought him here, spoke instead. "That someone wanted to keep you hidden." Jerome's breath caught. "Why?" A long silence stretched between them. Then David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because the people who took you, never wanted me to find you." Jerome's stomach twisted into knots. He didn't know what to believe. Didn't know if this was some elaborate lie or the truth he had never known he needed. But one thing was certain. Someone had stolen his past. And now, they might be watching. Waiting. Still trying to keep him in the dark. Jerome's breath came fast and shallow. His mind spun, trying to grasp the weight of what had just been said. Someone had taken him. Stolen him from a man who was supposed to be his father. And now, all these years later, they were still out there, watching, waiting, maybe even ready to pull him back into the shadows if he got too close to the truth. Shadow let out a low growl, sensing the shift in the air. Jerome's hands clenched into fists. He didn't want to believe any of this. It felt too big, too impossible. But deep inside, there was a whisper of something that told him this wasn't a lie. This wasn't a game. David Carter. His father. Jerome's voice came out hoarse. If what you're saying is true, if someone took me, then who? David and the two men exchanged glances, hesitation flickering between them. It was the shorter man, Miles, who spoke next. His tone was careful, as if stepping over broken glass. There's a name that's come up in our investigation. Someone with power. Influence. And a reason to keep you hidden. Jerome's pulse quickened. Who? David's jaw tightened. His hands curled at his sides like he was trying to steady himself. Then, finally, he said the name. Samuel Raines. The room seemed to go cold. Jerome blinked. The name meant nothing to him, but the way David said it, the weight in his voice, sent an unease crawling up his spine. He shook his head. Who is that? David exhaled slowly, his expression grim. A man who destroyed lives. Mine. Yours. His eyes darkened. And he's not done yet. Jerome swallowed. Why would he take me? David hesitated. Then he finally sat down, leaning forward, his hands clasped together. Because of me. The words hung in the air, heavy and full of something Jerome couldn't quite name. David's gaze locked onto his. I wasn't always the man you see now. I made enemies. Powerful ones. Samuel Raines was at the center of it all. And when I crossed him, he took the one thing I couldn't afford to lose. His voice cracked. You. Jerome's chest tightened. His fingers dug into his jeans as anger and confusion swirled inside him. You're saying this man stole me to get back at you? David nodded. I spent years looking for answers. But every time I got close, the trail went cold. It was like you had been erased. Until now. Jerome felt his heart pounding against his ribs. If this was true, if everything David was saying was real, then that meant someone out there had spent years making sure he never found out who he really was. And worse, they still might be watching. As if on cue, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Everyone froze. Shadow's ears perked, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The two men, Miles and the taller one, Carter, exchanged tense glances before moving toward the front entrance. David stood abruptly, his body going rigid. No one else was supposed to know we're here. Jerome's pulse spiked. A chill ran through him. Something was wrong. A second knock, louder, more urgent this time. Carter reached for the door but hesitated. He glanced back at David, waiting for instruction. David nodded once. Open it. But be ready. Carter unlatched the lock and pulled the heavy door open just enough to see outside. Jerome strained to catch a glimpse, his heart hammering in his chest. A figure stood just beyond the threshold, shrouded in the dim glow of the streetlights. A woman, dressed in dark clothing, her face partially obscured by the night. Carter's stance stiffened. Who are you? The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lifted her gaze, locking eyes with Jerome. And then, she spoke. My name is Olivia Raines, she said quietly. And if you want to survive what's coming, you need to listen to me. The name hit like a shockwave. Raines. As in Samuel Raines. Jerome's entire body went rigid. He didn't move, barely even breathed. He didn't know who this woman was, but he knew one thing for sure, if she was connected to the man who had stolen him, she was dangerous. Carter shifted, blocking her from stepping inside. "Why should we trust you?" she sighed, shaking her head. "Because I'm the only one who can tell Jerome the truth about why he was taken." She paused, her gaze flicking to David. "And who was really behind it?" David's face darkened. "We already know who's behind it." But Olivia shook her head, her expression grim. "No, you don't." She looked back at Jerome, her voice dropping lower. "Because the person who wanted to keep you hidden wasn't just Samuel Rains." Jerome's mouth went dry. A pause, thick with tension. Then Olivia exhaled and said the words that would change everything. "It was your mother." Jerome felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. His mother? The very idea made his mind reel. For years, he had believed she was gone, either dead or simply absent, someone who had never wanted him. But now Olivia Rains was standing there, claiming she had been the one behind it all. David's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're lying." His voice was sharp, filled with anger and disbelief. "She would never." Olivia cut him off. "She did." Her gaze didn't waver. "And I can prove it." Jerome's heart pounded. His hands were clammy, his breath unsteady. Every instinct told him to run, to get away from whatever truth she was about to drop. But he couldn't. He had come too far. Shadow nudged his leg, sensing his unease. Jerome swallowed hard and forced himself to speak. "Tell me everything." Olivia stepped inside, glancing warily at Carter and Miles before fixing her eyes on David. "You never knew the full story," she said. "You thought Samuel Rains took Jerome as revenge. That he was the one who erased him." She exhaled slowly. "But he wasn't working alone." David shook his head. "That doesn't make sense. She loved Jerome. She would have fought for him." Olivia gave a sad, almost bitter smile. "She did fight. But not the way you think." She turned back to Jerome, her voice softer now. "Your mother was terrified. Not of you. Not of losing you. But of what would happen if you stayed in David's world." She hesitated. "You don't remember, do you?" Jerome stiffened. He barely remembered anything from his early childhood. His life before the streets, before loneliness, was just a blur. Olivia continued. "David was in deep with dangerous people back then. Samuel was just one of them. There were others, powerful men, men who didn't forgive mistakes. And your mother, she knew that keeping you close to David meant putting a target on your back." Jerome's mouth was dry. "So she gave me away." The words felt foreign on his tongue. Olivia nodded. "She made a deal with Samuel. He promised to make you disappear, to hide you so well that no one could ever use you against your father. It was the only way she knew how to protect you." David took a step back, shaking his head violently. "No," his voice cracked. "She would have told me. She wouldn't have let me believe he was dead." "She couldn't," Olivia said. "Samuel didn't just hide Jerome, he made sure you never found him. And when she tried to go back on the deal, when she regretted what she had done." Olivia's voice dropped. "He made sure she didn't get the chance." Silence filled the room. David's face went pale. "What are you saying?" Olivia's expression softened. "I'm saying Samuel Rains didn't just take your son. He took her too." Jerome's stomach churned. His mother had tried to undo what she'd done. And she had paid the price. His hands clenched. "Where is she now?" Olivia hesitated. "Gone." Her voice was quiet. "She tried to fight back, to get you back. But Samuel made sure she never did." The words hit like a punch to the gut. A grief Jerome had never known he carried washed over him. He had spent years thinking he had been abandoned. But in the end, his mother had fought for him, And she had lost. David turned away, his shoulders trembling. Jerome could see it, the guilt, the anger, the unbearable weight of realizing that the woman he had loved had been trying to protect them both, and he had never known. A long silence stretched between them. Then Olivia spoke again. "There's one last thing you need to know." Jerome looked at her, his heart still hammering. "What?" Her eyes flicked to the door. "Samuel knows you're alive. And now that the truth is coming out, he won't let you walk away." As if on cue, headlights flooded the windows. Jerome's blood ran cold. David turned sharply, reaching for something under his coat. Carter and Miles exchanged tense looks, both moving toward the front entrance. Shadow's ears went up, his body tense. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Jerome took a shaky breath. "Is it him?" No one answered. Then. A sharp knock. 3 loud, deliberate bangs against the door. A voice followed. Deep. Calm. "I think it's time we talked." Jerome's stomach twisted. He didn't need to ask who it was. Samuel Raines had come for him. The room was heavy with silence. The knock still echoed in Jerome's ears, but no one moved. Everyone knew what this moment meant. Samuel Raines had come, and there was no turning back now. David's fingers twitched near his waist, his eyes darting toward Carter and Miles, who had already positioned themselves near the door. Olivia took a step back, her face pale but unreadable. Shadow let out a deep, warning growl, his body tense as if sensing the danger in the air. Jerome swallowed hard. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had spent his entire life running, from the past, from the unknown, from the truth. But now, the truth had come straight to his doorstep, and there was nowhere left to go. David took a slow breath and stepped forward. His hand rested on the doorknob, but he didn't open it yet. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at Jerome. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you don't let him get in your head. You understand?" Jerome nodded, but his stomach was a knot of nerves. Another knock, this time lighter, almost patient. Then Samuel's voice again, smooth and calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk." David scoffed under his breath but finally pulled the door open. Standing outside was an older man, dressed in a dark, expensive suit. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his sharp eyes held no fear. Behind him, 2 men in black suits stood still, their presence an unspoken warning. Samuel's gaze flickered over David, then to Carter and Miles, before settling on Jerome. A slow, knowing smile formed on his lips. "You've grown," he said simply. Jerome didn't respond. His body felt frozen, yet his mind raced. This was the man who had stolen his life, manipulated his mother, and controlled the shadows of his past. And now, he stood here as if none of it mattered. Samuel took a slow step forward, but David held out a hand, stopping him. "That's close enough." Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "Still so protective, David. Always thinking you can stop things from falling apart." His eyes returned to Jerome. "But I think the boy deserves to hear the rest of the truth." Olivia shifted uncomfortably. "He's heard enough." Samuel gave her a glance, amused. "Oh, Olivia. You always were sentimental." He sighed. "You told him what his mother did. But you didn't tell him why she really made that choice." Jerome's fingers curled into fists. "What else is there to know?" Samuel studied him for a moment, then said, "She wasn't just afraid for your safety. She was afraid of you." The words sent a chill through Jerome's spine. He shook his head. "That's a lie." Samuel tilted his head. "Is it?" He took a slow step to the side, glancing at David. "She knew what kind of man your father was. The enemies he made. The choices he made. His eyes darkened. And she knew you had that same fire inside of you. David's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. Samuel looked back at Jerome. She was terrified that one day, you'd become just like him. That you'd get caught up in the same world he did. And she couldn't let that happen. He sighed. So she made a deal with me to take you away. To erase you from that path before it was too late. Jerome's head spun. His mother hadn't just been protecting him from the outside world. She had been protecting him from himself. Samuel's voice softened. She wanted you to have a chance at a different life. One where you wouldn't have to fight to survive. One where you wouldn't become a man like David. He spread his hands. And in the end, isn't that exactly what happened? You were free. Until now. The words hit deep, but Jerome refused to let them sink in. He shook his head. No. You don't get to twist this. My mother fought for me. She wanted me back. And you made sure she never got that chance. His voice was steady now, anger simmering beneath his skin. You don't get to rewrite history. Samuel's smile faded slightly, as if he saw the fight in Jerome's eyes and knew he wasn't going to bend. He let out a slow breath. I see. He took a step back. Then I suppose there's nothing left to say. Jerome expected him to fight, to threaten, to lash out. But instead, Samuel simply turned away. His men followed, and within seconds, they were walking toward the two black Mercedes that had been waiting outside. David, Carter, and Miles all stood tense, waiting for something to happen. But Samuel simply opened the car door, paused for just a second, and glanced back at Jerome. One day, he said, his voice calm, you'll understand. And then he got inside, and the cars disappeared into the night. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of what had just happened still hung in the air. Finally, David exhaled, running a hand over his face. That was too easy, he muttered. Jerome's chest was still tight, but something inside him had settled. Samuel Raines had tried to control his life, his past, his future. But Jerome wasn't that lost boy anymore. He wasn't a pawn in someone else's game. He was free. Shadow pressed against his leg, and Jerome reached down, running a hand through the dog's fur. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in his life, he knew one thing for certain. His story wasn't over. It was just beginning.